What's going on? My name is Russ Hawkins and I'm an athletic restoration coach. And I want to show you something on this board that most individuals never explain to you. And it's why your hips stay tight no matter how many times you stretch them out. Now, the hip flexor isn't tight because it's short. It's tight because your nervous system is using it as an emergency brace for a chain that's already broken. Now I'm going to walk you through step by step. So, hip flexors. We're going to start here. The primary hip flexor is the psoas that runs from your lumbar vertebrae all the way down through the pelvis and attaches to the top of your femur. It crosses two joints, which is very important. It's both a hip flexor and a lumbar spine stabilizer. So when you sit for hours, train with poor mechanics, or take an impact hit, the nervous system detects instability at the spine, and the psoas responds by shortening and locking. It's not being lazy, it's being protective. It's the nervous system's version of grabbing a safety rail. The problem is, once it locks, everything downstream from that joint changes. Now we move on to the glute med. The moment the hip flexors grip and anteriorly tilt the pelvis, the glute med gets an inhibition signal. Here's what the glute med actually does and why losing it is catastrophic. The glute med sits on the outer hip, so its job is lateral pelvic control. Every single time you take a step, your glute med on the stance leg fires to keep your pelvis level. It's the reason you walk without waddling. Now, for athletes, cutting, decelerating, single leg standing, glute med is the primary shock absorber. It absorbs up to 3 times the body weight when you land. No glute med signal equals no shock absorption. So when the psoas locks and it tilts the pelvis forward, the glute med's fiber angle changes. The nervous system reads that as a biomechanically inefficient position and pulls the activation signal. It doesn't fire fully, and here's what most people miss. The glute max doesn't compensate for the glute med. Those two have two different jobs, actually. You can have a strong developed glute max and still have a completely offline glute med, which leads us into the next problem. Now the body has a problem. The pelvis is unstable laterally. The glute med isn't doing its job, so the nervous system recruits the next available stabilizer, which is the quadratus lumborum. And this is a deep posterior muscle. It runs from the iliac crest, the top of your hip, up to the 12th rib and also attaches to the transverse processes of L1 through L4. It's designed to laterally flex the spine and to anchor the 12th rib during forced breathing. It's a secondary stabilizer at best. But when the glute med goes offline, the QL gets recruited as a primary lateral stabilizer for every single step. That is not what it's built for, so it's doing the job of multiple different muscle groups. It's like using a rope to hold up a bridge. It works until it doesn't. So long term, the QL overload creates 3 distinct problems. Number 1, it compresses the lumbar vertebrae, increasing disc pressure on the same side. Number 2, it creates a lateral pelvic tilt that makes one hip appear higher than the other. And number 3, this is the one nobody really talks about. It creates a constant pulling force on the 12th rib. Now, why does that matter? Because your diaphragm attaches to the 12th rib. We'll get there in a second, don't worry. The QL is the muscle that wakes athletes up at 3 a.m. or anybody who sits at a desk for multiple hours a day, and you find yourself with that chronic low back pain. It's the one that seizes after a hard leg session, and every other person tells you to foam roll it. And I want you to understand that that's triggering your fire alarm again. Next, the QL's attachment point pulls upward on the lower thoracic spine, as we see here, specifically around T12 and L1. Sustained QL tension creates a comprehensive and rotational force on that junction. Now, your thoracic spine is supposed to rotate roughly 35 to 50 degrees in each direction. It's the engine of rotation for throwing, swinging, running, and changing direction. When the lower thoracic gets compressed by the QL, that rotation locks down. The thoracic spine also has a direct relationship with the rib cage and the 12 pairs of ribs attached to the thoracic vertebrae. When T-spine mobility decreases, the rib cage stops moving the way it should. The ribs stop expanding laterally on inhale, and they start to compress and flare inside. And that changes everything for the structure sitting directly above the diaphragm. Now, the diaphragm, what we have here in this photo to the right, is a dome-shaped muscle that spans the entire base of the rib cage. The key part is the lumbar vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae extensions run to L3. So the diaphragm literally connects to the same lumbar vertebrae that the QL, the psoas, are attached to. This is one structure, not separate systems. Again, reframe everything to having everything connected in the system. And on a healthy inhale, the diaphragm descends, creates negative pressure in the thorax, and allows the lungs to expand downward. The pelvic floor responds by dropping slightly. The transverse abdominis creates a 360-degree brace. And this is what intra-abdominal pressure, like I spoke in my last video, was all about. Creates management, looks like when it's working. When the QL is overloaded and pulling on the 12th rib and has lost mobility and restricted the rib cage, the diaphragm cannot fully descend. It's mechanically blocked. So instead of moving down, it pulls up and forward, and the ribs start to flare. The belly juts out, and now instead of a deep pressurized breath, you're breathing into your chest, which then leads to the last stop in the cascade, and the most important one. Slow diaphragmatic breathing activates your vagus nerve, okay, which drives the parasympathetic tone. That's the signal that tells your nervous system the environment is safe. Your heart rate variability goes up, cortisol goes down, and the muscle tone regulates. So when you shallow chest breathe, it activates the sympathetic nervous system. The nervous system reads shallow breathing as a threat signal. So this is now present, and the psoas locks even harder. You've now closed the loop. Tight psoas, your diaphragm becomes restricted. Shallow breathing, which leads to a threat signal, leads to psoas locks even tighter. Again, this is not a flexibility problem. This is a nervous system regulation problem that has a mechanical expression. 5 downstream effects from one locked hip flexor, and every single one feeds back into the first. Now, every time you stretch and get 20 minutes of relief, that's a parasympathetic window. The stretch activates the Golgi tendon organ, which temporarily inhibits the muscle spindle and gives you a false release. The muscle didn't actually change its length. What had happened was that the nervous system pattern actually didn't change throughout that. The moment you stand up and load the system, walk to your car, go up the steps, bend down to pick something off the ground, the nervous system rereads the environment, detects the same instability signal, and reloads the pattern because nothing below changed the alarm. Stretching is addressing the fire alarm. The fire is the instability pattern that you're currently going through. No glute med signal, no diaphragm breath, no safety signal getting to the psoas. And this is the loop that nobody shows you. So when you have no glute med that fires off a signal, your hip feels unstable, your psoas grips to protect, your glute med becomes blocked, and then you go back into that same loop, into that same pattern where pain reoccurs no matter what you do. Now the nervous system, because of that, keeps the hip tight because it doesn't have a better answer just yet. You haven't given it one. Now, in the restart sequence, you need to work in reverse. You can't start at the hip. The nervous system will resist anything you do at the hip until the safety signals above are restored. So how we start first is step 1, reset the breath. Diaphragmatic breathing reactivates the vagus nerve and starts lowering the sympathetic threat signal. 90-90 breathing, crocodile breathing, box breathing. The goal is full diaphragm descent and 360-degree rib expansion. This is the prerequisite for everything else that follows. So next we got to do in step 2, restoring T-spine mobility. Once the breath is restored, the rib cage can move. The thoracic rotation drills, quadruped thread the needle, open book stretches. These open the mechanical space for the diaphragm to move properly and decompress the quadratus laborum that is currently pulling. Step number 3 is releasing the QL. Now with the T-spine mobile and your breath regulated, the QL stops being recruited as the primary stabilizer. Now you can use targeted QL release work like 90-90 lateral hip opening, side lying QL stretches with full exhale, and then the release is real after all of this because the nervous system finally has a safety signal it needed. Step number 4 is the glute med activation. Reactivating the glute med with clamshells, side lying hip abduction, banded lateral walks, but done slowly with controlled intention. After the QL has released, the glute med can now receive activation, proper signaling, because the pelvis has been repositioned. And step number 5, the hip lets go. Not because you stretched it, because the nervous system doesn't need to grip anymore. The lateral stability is stored, the breath is deep, the safety signal is on. The psoas receives a stand down signal and the hip flexor genuinely lengthens. And now we're going to walk through 3 simple tests that you can do right now to understand where you are in the shutdown sequence. So test number 1 is a single leg stand for 30 seconds. Watch yourself in a mirror and watch your hips specifically. If the opposite hip drops, the glute med is offline. If you feel your QL grab and hike, it's already compensating. Now, test number 2, hand on your rib cage, breathing test. When you do this, one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly, take a full inhale. If your chest rises first and your belly barely moves, the diaphragm is restricted, you're stuck in sympathetic dominance. And test number 3, QL palpation. Press into the space between your last rib and the top of your hip bone, either side of the spine. If it's tender and feels like a rope under the skin that's extremely tight, it's been compensating for months, possibly even years. Now, if you failed 2 or more of these tests, so all 3, this is your chain. Address it in the right order to fix it. And this is everything you need to know to loosen up your hips for good. And if you're interested in one-on-one coaching, click the link below to understand how to reset the nervous system to work in your favor, move pain-free again, fix your pain, find your purpose.